Book 2. Chapter 7. Back in Phandalin. The wind that swept down from the Sword Mountains carried the bite of late winter. Beneath a canopy of stars, Zyra and Doreen had sought refuge in their tent, while Balin was snoring under the stars and Ilara was sitting in meditation. Morthal, however, stood apart, gazing into the star-dusted dark. The ghosts of Baldur's Gate had resurfaced and were swirling around him like unseen snow. A woman's desperate scream echoing through marble halls, his own voice shouting orders that came too late. His helm cradled in trembling hands, the weight of countless eyes upon him, whispers that cut deeper than blades.
You have dishonored the very essence of the...
He closed his eyes, but the images only intensified.
I should have known,
he whispered to the darkness.
I should have seen the signs.
But now the weight of leadership settled on him anew. Today at Wyvern Tor, when Helm's power had flowed through him again. He'd felt it again, purpose, clarity, the divine touch he'd feared lost forever.
Helm, I understand now. You never abandoned me. You merely tested the depths of my faith, guiding me through darkness to find my rightful path.
Morthal whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air.
Grant me strength to shepherd these wayward souls.
They needed someone to command them, and he was the chosen one. Over the next few days, as they descended from the highlands, the air softened, thawing into the hesitant warmth of spring. Ilara, gaunt and silent since the ordeal at the Wyvern Tor, seemed to slowly mend, his wounds knitting faster than the fraying edges of his mind.
You're improving,
Morthal observed one evening as Ilara methodically sharpened his blades.
Am I?
Ilara replied, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel.
Or does the flesh just keep wandering back?
Conversely, Zyra, who had yearned for the familiarity of Phandalin, grew increasingly withdrawn. The closer they drew to the town, the tighter the knot of dread became in her stomach. Garael. The name echoed with both hope and terror. How could she face the gentle priestess, knowing the truth coiled beneath her skin?
You've been quiet,
Doreen remarked, sidling up beside her wagon.
Worried about your half-healed wounds?
No,
Zyra said, absently tracing patterns on the weathered wood.
Just, thinking about home.
Doreen snorted.
Phandalin's hardly home. Just a dusty waypoint for people like us.
And what are we?
Zyra asked, her voice edged with something sharp.
Survivors, darling, nothing more.
On the sixth evening, Phandalin emerged in the valley below, its scattered lights twinkling against the deepening twilight, a deceptively peaceful harbor nestled next to the Sword Mountains. They made straight for the town master's hall. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of old parchment and stale authority. Morthal, standing tall before Harbin Wester and Sildar Hallwinter, recounted their trials. The desperate defense of Butterskull Ranch, the grim necessity of putting down the orc infestation.
The ranch hands?
Sildar asked, his weathered face grave.
5 dead,
Morthal reported.
We buried them with what dignity we could offer.
But when he spoke of the main house, consumed by flames, the memory surged through Zyra, acrid smoke, the roar of uncontrolled power, Ilara's name torn from her throat. A wave of guilt, sharp and suffocating, crashed over her. Tears blurring her vision, she choked back a sob and fled the hall, unable to bear the weight of their gazes. Doreen watched Zyra's retreat with a calculating glance before turning back to the proceedings, drumming her fingers impatiently against her leg. Balin, however, frowned deeply.
Running from herself, that one is.
Morthal cleared his throat and continued the report, detailing the subsequent clash at Wyvern Tor, confirming Sildar's suspicion that the orcs were indeed displaced, driven down from the peaks by the White Dragon.
So it's true.
Sildar murmured, exchanging a troubled glance with Harbin.
The rumors weren't exaggerated.
Harbin, his eyes gleaming with mercantile interest, shuffled through some papers.
Well, quite an accounting. Let me see, 100 gold for Butterskull. Though considering the destruction of property—
The destruction
Morthal interrupted, voice hardening.
occurred during our defense of Big Al against overwhelming odds. A defense your coin purchased, Townmaster.
Harbin's jowls quivered slightly.
Still, procedures must be followed. Forms to complete, damages to assess.
We fulfilled our contract.
Morthal placed both palms on the desk, leaning forward.
Men died. Good men. And you sit here counting coppers and considering deductions.
Sildar stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Morthal's shoulder.
Harbin, these adventurers have risked their lives repeatedly for Phandalin's safety.
Harbin's lips pinched together, but he nodded reluctantly.
Very well, very well. 100 for Butterskull, another 100 for Wyvern Tor, and—
He hesitated, fingers tightening around his coin purse.
And the bonus for saving Big Al.
Morthal reminded him, his tone leaving no room for negotiation.
Yes, of course.
Harbin muttered, reluctantly counting out additional coins with exaggerated care.
Though one might argue that preserving his life was merely fulfilling the basic terms of engagement.
One might also argue
Doreen interjected smoothly.
the value of a townmaster's word.
Harbin blanched slightly and pushed the full payment across the desk.
Your services appreciated.
Their next stop was Daran Idermath's orchard, but first they sought Zira. Doreen, using her sending stone, found her huddled by the roadside, shoulders shaking beneath a spreading apple tree. The evening breeze carried distant laughter from the Stonehill Inn, an incongruous soundtrack to her distress.
I look dreadful.
Zyra lamented through sniffles, scrubbing at her tear-stained face.
Puffy eyes, blotchy skin. I can't meet anyone like this.
Her fingers trembled as they traced the contours of her face, seeking imperfections as if they were evidence of deeper failings. Morthal cleared his throat, standing awkwardly before her.
Nonsense.
He attempted, his tone more appropriate for a battlefield assessment than comfort.
You look as beautiful as always.
The words hung in the air, leaden and unconvincing.
As beautiful as always?
Doreen snorted, crossing her arms.
Gods, Morthal, with compliments like that, it's a wonder you haven't charmed half the Sword Coast. What she means is she looks like a complete mess, and what you meant to say was that it doesn't matter.
Zyra let out a watery laugh despite herself, wiping her eyes on her sleeve.
Is that what he meant? I couldn't tell.
I was trying to be—
Morthal frowned, searching for the word.
Gallant,
offered Balin.
kind.
Morthal corrected.
Try again tomorrow.
Daran Edermath, weathered and smelling faintly of apples and earth, greeted them amidst his trees. Morthal began recounting their discoveries at Old Owl Well, the Red Wizard, his undead laborers, the unearthed pendant.
We found him conducting some sort of excavation.
Morthal explained, his posture formal despite the pastoral setting.
Using necromancy to power his labor force.
Zyra cleared her throat softly.
Perhaps we should show him the letter.
Her voice was gentle but firm, the suggestion carrying the weight of a command. Morthal's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his pack and produced the weathered parchment.
Yes, of course.
He said, the words clipped as he handed the letter to Daran.
This may explain more than I could.
Daran's fingers, calloused from decades of orchard work, carefully unfolded the document. As he read, the cheerful lines around his eyes deepened into furrows of concern.
The wizard had undead digging at the ruins.
Morthal continued.
They were excavating inside the tower foundations,
Zara corrected softly.
and the letter identifies him as Hammon Kost.
Daran looked up from the letter, his gaze shifting to Zira.
And what about the talisman?
Metal of some sort.
Morthal interjected.
Quite unremarkable, really.
There was carved a 5-armed, swirling star-like symbol,
Zira added.
with glyphs we could not recognize.
Morthal nodded quickly.
That's what I meant. The craftsmanship was, quite distinctive.
A fallen blossom drifted onto his shoulder as Daran's attention remained fixed on Zira.
A red wizard's presence is troubling enough.
Daran said, pouring them more apple cider from an earthenware pitcher.
But excavating those old tower ruins, there's power in those ancient stones, and not the benevolent kind. And the talisman?
Daran asked, turning fully to Zira, a half-eaten apple forgotten in his hand.
Did you say it was whispering?
Yes, the whispering was so faint I couldn't quite make out the words, but something about it felt familiar, like I should know it. And the voice itself, it was powerful, frightening.
It only happened once.
Morthal interjected, tone casual.
Gotta be nothing.
Daran set his apple down on the rough-hewn table. His weathered face had gone pale beneath his tan. He glanced again at the letter, his finger tracing over the words.
Resurrecting Voragax and for the glory of the 5-headed queen. This is beyond my knowing,
he said finally.
You need to take this letter and the talisman to Sildar. These references to Voragax and the 5-headed queen.
He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Morthal stood abruptly.
Then I shall consult with Sildar,
he announced, reclaiming control of the conversation with a note of finality that brooked no argument. The group fragmented. Morthal returned to Sildar. Doreen slipped towards the miners' exchange. Balin, Ilara, and Zira sought lodging at the Stonehill Inn. No sooner had Zira stepped into the common room, the scent of ale and wood smoke filling her senses, than a joyful cry pierced the low murmur of conversation.
Zira!
Garael rushed forward, knocking aside an empty chair in her haste. Her face was alight with such naked relief and happiness that several patrons turned to stare. She enveloped Zira in a fierce hug that seemed to contain more emotion than the priestess typically displayed in a month. Zira clung back, the tension draining from her in a rush. They held the embrace, and when they finally broke apart, their hands remained linked, fingers intertwined, with an intimacy that made a grizzled miner nudge his companion.
I was so worried,
Garael whispered, her eyes searching Zira's face with an intensity that seemed to forget they stood in the middle of the tavern.
Sending you to Agatha. I regretted it the moment you left.
Ilara shifted uncomfortably behind them. His gaze flickered between Zira's face and their joined hands, a small furrow appearing between his brows as he inched closer to Zira.
She was...
Zira began, then faltered, remembering the banshee's cold rage.
She was, accommodating. Eventually.
Her voice softened, bright with a happiness that seemed to momentarily push aside the guilt and fear she'd been carrying.
You succeeded.
Garael's eyes widened, her normal composure nowhere to be found as she bounced slightly on her toes, like an excited child.
We did indeed,
Balin rumbled, setting down their packs with a thud that drew attention back to the rest of the party.
Though might suggest celebrating somewhere, lays. Attentive.
He gestured broadly at the tavern where at least half the patrons were now watching with undisguised interest. A flush crept up Garaela's neck as she became aware of the attention, yet her smile didn't dim as she reluctantly released Zira's hands.
Bowgentle's spellbook,
she whispered, taking a small step back.
Pass to a mage named Cernoth of Uriabor.
Zira confirmed, feeling a small spark of pride kindle amid the ashes of her self-doubt. Garaele glanced around, suddenly conscious of the whispers their reunion had sparked.
You must visit me later this evening.
She said, lowering her voice.
For your payment.
The last word hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken possibilities.
Of course.
Zira agreed, her voice betraying more eagerness than she intended.
I'll be there.
While Zira felt the fragile bloom of hope, Alara retreated into the shadows of his own mind. Upstairs, in the sparse inn-room, he drew forth the doll's head, salvaged long ago from the ashes of his past. Its porcelain face, blackened and heat-warped, seemed to watch him with accusatory emptiness. In the lonely silence of his night watches, he had begun to hear it speak, its voice uncannily like Zira's, like Eli's. Now, clutching the grim relic, he knelt not on the floor, but within the ruins of his own making.
Forgive me,
he whispered to the doll, his voice cracking.
I thought blood would wash it away. That enough pain could undo what was done.
The flames at Butterskull Ranch had done more than destroy a homestead. They had ripped open a wound, long scabbed over, bleeding fresh memories into his consciousness. He could smell the burning again, hear the high, terrified screams.
Alara, help me, please!
Eli's voice, not as he remembered it in his waking hours, but as it truly had been. A child's voice, desperate and believing, until the end that his big brother would save him. His fingers tightened around the doll's head until his knuckles whitened, his body rocking slightly back and forth as the memory washed over him. Redemption could not be bought with blood. He knew that now. The faces of those he had killed in his quest for atonement blurred with the faces of those he had failed. So he prayed. First just to Helm, but soon to any power that might listen. The doll's head prayed with him, a twisted icon in his trembling hands, his whispers weaving a desperate plea for an absolution. From below came the sound of Zira's laughter, bright and clear as it drifted up through the floorboards, the sound of someone stepping into joy without the weight of ghosts holding them back. At the town hall, Morthal laid the evidence before Sildar, the signed letter and the heavy, malevolent pendant. Sildar reached for it, then hesitated, his hand hovering inches above the five-headed sigil. After a moment's deliberation, he withdrew a handkerchief from his pocket and used it to lift the pendant instead.
Tiamat,
he breathed, the name tasting like ash. His typically composed demeanor fractured, revealing a flash of fear before he mastered himself.
the Dragon Queen.
Morthal had faced countless dangers without flinching, but something in Sildar's reaction sent a cold ripple down his spine.
You know this symbol?
He asked, though he could already read the answer in Sildar's grim expression.
Yes, I know this cult.
Sildar replied, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, as if afraid the name might summon attention. He carefully set the pendant down and pushed it away with the cloth.
Tiamat, imprisoned in the 9 hells, but forever seeking return through her mortal worshippers.
Sildar abruptly stood, crossed to a cabinet, and extracted a flask. His hands weren't quite steady as he poured 2 measures of amber liquid, offering one to Morthal.
I haven't touched this since the ambush that took Gundren,
he admitted.
but some revelations demand fortification.
The pieces began to slot into a terrifying mosaic, the red wizard digging at Old Owl Well, the sudden appearance of Cryovane, the mention of raising the dragon Voragax from Wave Echo Cave.
This is larger than the treasures of Wave Echo Cave.
Sildar mused grimly, draining his drink in one swallow.
Something connected to the Dragon Queen's prison.
He moved to the window, checking that the shutters were secured before returning to the table. With deliberate care, he wrapped the pendant in several layers of cloth and handed it back to Morthal.
I must send word to Neverwinter immediately,
he said, pressing a hand against his Lord's Alliance insignia as if drawing strength from it.
Speak with your companions. All of them. Especially the one who handled this thing.
Morthal nodded, feeling the weight of this new threat settle across his shoulders. He had expected to find missing shipments, perhaps bandits, not a cult that could potentially unleash the Dragon Queen upon the world.
There's a reason dragons are suddenly stirring in these lands,
Sildar said softly, his gaze distant and troubled.
And I fear we've only glimpsed the edge of a much darker design.
Meanwhile, in the back room of the Miners' Exchange, Doreen spun her own version of their adventures for Halia Thornton. They sat in Halia's private office, a space of calculated contrasts, simple wooden furniture that belied the expensive Sembian carpet underfoot. Halia listened, her expression unreadable, her mind clearly calculating.
So you killed this wizard yourself?
She asked, leaning forward slightly, fingers steepled before her chin.
A clean kill,
Doreen confirmed with a hint of pride, unconsciously straightening in her chair to mirror Halia's posture.
He was unconscious and never saw it coming.
Halia's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly.
And before this clean kill, you extracted what information he had.
There was no need.
Doreen waved dismissively, failing to notice how Halia's fingers had tightened against each other.
We found a letter afterward that told us everything important.
A letter?
Halia repeated flatly.
How convenient.
She reached for the wine decanter, filling Doreen's glass with deliberately measured movements. The Red Wizard's presence troubled her, but not enough to alter her intricate plans for Phandalin.
And how does our righteous cleric fare?
She asked, swirling her untouched wine.
Has his faith been tested during these trials?
Morthal?
Doreen offered, sensing Halia's interest in potential allies.
He talks of duty, but he looks away when it serves him. His allegiance is flexible, given the right incentive.
Halia nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes.
Good. We need men like him.
She set her glass down with precision.
Some other elements might eventually need removing.
The elf Alara is utterly broken,
Doreen readily denounced, leaning in conspiratorially.
Something's not right with his mind. Stares at nothing, speaks to no one, constantly distracted.
Unstable allies are potentially dangerous,
Halia observed, her chair creaking as she reclined slightly. But when Halia inquired about Zira with a casual gesture that belied her intense scrutiny, a flicker of guarded loyalty surfaced. Doreen hesitated, then deflected, concealing the sorceress's draconic secret. She still considered Zira a friend, a vulnerability she instinctively hid from Halia.
Ambitious but naive,
Doreen said instead, her gaze dropping momentarily to her wine.
Skilled but sentimental.
Remember, darling,
Halia purred, her voice silk over steel.
Keep tempting that righteous cleric to look the other way at the little things. A pilfered coin here, a necessary deception there, until averting his gaze becomes as natural to him as prayer.
Halia rose smoothly to her feet, signaling the conversation's end.
And assert yourself within the group, Doreen. Our grip on this town tightens. Brawny controls the militia. The fools here accept the red brands as protectors. Harbin is easily led. Only Sildar poses a potential obstacle.
That evening, Zira spent hours preparing, bathing, selecting her finest dress, fussing with her hair, her nerves a tangled mess.
Do I look presentable?
She asked, turning to Doreen, who lounged on her bed, amused by the spectacle.
You look like someone trying far too hard to impress a priestess,
Doreen replied with a smirk.
But passable, I suppose.
Finally, an hour later, and her heart pounding, she knocked on Garayele's door. First, they spoke of Agatha, of the mission completed, but the conversation quickly shifted. Garaele gently, earnestly, renewed her invitation for Zira to join the Harpers, the secretive network dedicated to preserving balance and protecting the innocent.
You've proven yourself more than capable.
Garael said warmly.
Your courage, your resourcefulness. The Harpers need people like you, Zira.
Zyra turned away, the carefully constructed dam within her finally breaking. She said, voice barely above a whisper,
You deserve the truth.
With hesitant fingers, she revealed the iridescent scales that adorned her back like a terrible birthright.
They manifested when I was 12. My father's legacy.
She confessed, eyes downcast.
Initially, just a small cluster, conceivable beneath clothing. But they spread. My mother wept when she saw them. It didn't take long until the other children discovered my secret. They pursued me with stones and taunts of Dragon's Bride. And their parents talked about a curse, a bad omen, the destruction and plague I would bring. Eventually, I couldn't bear the shame anymore. I had to leave.
Zira's words tumbled out, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency.
I'm dangerous.
She choked out, expecting recoil, disgust.
A monster.
She braced herself to flee, but Garaeli simply reached out, her touch gentle on Zira's arm.
Blood doesn't define who you are, Zyra,
she said softly, her gaze unwavering.
Your actions do, and I have seen your heart. You are kind and good.
The simple, profound acceptance shattered Zira's defenses. Tears flowed freely now, not of guilt, but of overwhelming relief.
What occurred at Butterskull Ranch wasn't a spell. It was my essence manifesting. When threatened, something primal emerges that I cannot fully govern.
Her next words were nearly inaudible.
I couldn't stop it,
she admitted.
It was like something ancient awakened inside me, and part of me exulted in it. What does that make me?
Human,
Garael answered simply.
Flawed, powerful, and learning like all of us.
Zyra shook her head slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe such acceptance. A sob escaped her, and Garaele gently pulled her into an embrace. For a moment, Zira stiffened, unaccustomed to such contact, then gradually yielded to the comfort offered. After Zira's tears subsided, Garaele handed her a soft cloth to dry her eyes. She kept one hand on Zira's shoulder, maintaining that precious connection.
Do you carry this burden alone?
Garaele asked with gentle concern. Zyra straightened, regaining some of her composure.
Morthal discovered it while tending my wounds, and I told Doreen back in Neverwinter when we were closer.
How did they react?
Garaele asked quietly.
Morthal flinched in disgust. He tried to hide it.
Zyra said.
But it was in his eyes. Disgust, fear, the same look my villagers gave me. Doreen couldn't care less about the scales, but she stores every weakness like a miser hoards coins. Use them when it suits her.
Their conversation shifted, growing softer, more intimate. Garaele brewed tea, the herbal aroma filling the small room as she shared her own journey to Timora's service, her doubts, her struggles with faith. The candles burned lower, casting their faces in gentle, shifting light.
I've never told anyone these things,
Garaele admitted, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table between them.
Being a priestess, people expect certainty.
And being a harper?
Zira asked, noting how Garaele's hair caught the golden candlelight.
That's different.
Garaele smiled, looking up.
That's about believing in something other than faith or gods. It's believing in people like you.
The evening deepened around them. They moved from table to cushioned seats near the small hearth, the distance between them gradually shrinking as stories flowed more freely. Somehow, imperceptibly, their hands had drifted closer until Garaele's fingers brushed against Zira's, then tentatively entwined. They looked up, gazes locking, the air charged with unspoken emotion. Slowly, hesitantly, they leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt both impossibly brief and achingly long, a moment suspended in time. The gentle press of their lips carried the weight of newfound trust, of secrets shared and accepted. When they finally drew apart, it was like waking from a dream, dazed, breathless, their foreheads nearly touching as they gazed at each other with wonder and the first fluttering of deeper feeling.
I'm sorry.
Garael stammered, though her eyes remained fixed on Zyra's.
I shouldn't have.
Don't be.
Zyra whispered, a smile blooming despite her nervousness.
Please, don't be sorry.
The rest of the night passed in careful conversation, neither quite ready to acknowledge what had happened, yet unwilling to part. They spoke of safer things, Phandalen's history, tales of Timora's favor, the constellations visible through the house's small window, but their eyes kept finding each other. When dawn's first light filtered through the eastern window, Zyra reluctantly rose to leave. At the door, Garaele caught her hand.
I have a spare room,
she offered, her voice casual, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness.
It's small, but you'd be safer here than at the inn. And it would be nice to have company.
Zyra felt warmth spreading through her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar she didn't recognize it.
I'll think about it,
she promised, squeezing Garaele's hand. Walking back to the Stonehill Inn, Zyra's mind reeled with contradictory emotions. Fear warred with hope, old shame with new acceptance. She touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of their kiss. For the first time in years, she dared to imagine a future where she wasn't running from herself, from others, from connection. 2 days later, after sorting through her jumbled thoughts and gathering her courage, Zyra packed her few belongings. The short walk from the inn to Garael's house felt like crossing a boundary between her old life and something new, terrifying, and beautiful. That evening, she officially joined the Harpers, accepting both their silver pin and the small welcoming room, along with all the unspoken possibilities that waited there. While Zyra found a tentative peace, Ilara descended further into his self-imposed exile. He rarely left his room at the inn, emerging only sporadically, disheveled and hollow-eyed, to fetch food and ale before retreating back to his sanctuary of whispers. Each morning, Ilara would discover new elven prayers carved into the floorboards around his pallet, appearing overnight, though he had no memory of creating them. The first time, he traced the familiar loops and whirls with trembling fingers, certain he hadn't done this, yet recognizing his own handwriting.
Eli,
he would whisper, but only silence answered. His wash basin would shift positions between prayers. His dagger would appear under his pillow when he was certain he'd left it beside the window. Once he returned from a brief venture downstairs to find all his possessions meticulously arranged in a perfect circle around his bedroll. Time blurred. He stopped washing. His hair hung in greasy tangles. His clothes were stained and rank. Through the thin walls he could hear the sounds of the inn, laughter, arguments, the clink of tankards, life continuing. But these noises seemed to come from another world entirely, one he no longer belonged to. The prayers intensified, twisting from pleas for guidance into acts of penance. Sometimes he would snap back to awareness with blood on his palms, having gripped the blade too tightly while praying. These offerings of pain he directed not just to Helm, but to any entity that might witness his suffering, that might explain why objects moved, why words appeared, why sometimes he caught glimpses of things lurking in the corners of his vision.
You're safe in here,
he would murmur, though whether to himself, Zyra, or Eli, even he didn't know anymore.
jou brengen, lysgyn tan, an y ffin yn gweithio sbren o'r gorwedd.